The wind across the high plains spoke of nothing but distance and time. It scoured the land, leaving only hard-packed earth, stubborn sage, and the solitary cabin Elias had built with his own hands. He had come here to be forgotten, to let the silence and the emptiness grind his memories into dust. For a decade, it had nearly worked. The man he used to be was a ghost, a name whispered only in his own nightmares. Then came the wagon. It was a dark, lumbering shape against the bruised purple of the twilight, moving with the slow, agonizing persistence of a beetle crawling toward its grave. It did not belong here. Nothing did, except for him. Elias watched from the shadow of his porch, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle propped against the door frame. His knuckles were scarred and white. He was a tall man, made of sinew and bone, his face a landscape of hard angles and weathered skin carved by sun and regret. The wagon groaned to a halt 100 feet from his cabin. A long, weighted silence followed, broken only by the keening of the wind. Then, the canvas flap was pushed aside. A woman descended, her movement slow and deliberate. She was a large woman, built not of softness but of substance, her frame broad and formidable under a plain, dark dress. Another woman followed, nearly her twin in size and solemnity. Between them, clutching the hand of the first, was a small boy, no older than 7, with eyes as dark and serious as a winter well. They stood there, a strange and solid trinity in the vast emptiness, looking at his cabin as if it were a long-sought destination. The first woman, her face round and weary but possessed of a profound stillness, held up a folded piece of paper. It was a plea, a summons. Elias felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. He did not move. He was a stone, a part of the unforgiving land. But they did not leave. They simply stood, their forms solidifying in the deepening gloom, waiting. He could feel their gaze on him, a weight heavier than the endless sky. When the first woman finally spoke, her voice was low and clear, carrying across the distance without a tremor. Elias Thorne. The name was a key turning a lock deep inside him, a lock rusted shut with years of solitude and guilt. He felt his thumb trace the long, silvered scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture that cost him more than they could ever know. The woman's shoulders seemed to slump with a relief so heavy it was almost sorrowful. Behind her, the second woman's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief, of terrible recognition, crossing her features. "It is you," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind but their meaning landing like a blow. Lena was right. The cabin was a cramped and hostile space, built for one man's solitude, not for a sudden, burgeoning family. Elias had not invited them in. He had simply turned without a word and entered the cabin, leaving the door open in a gesture of grim resignation. To turn them away into the high plains night, with its plunging temperatures and unseen predators, was a cruelty even he could not stomach. They followed him inside, their bulk seeming to shrink the room, to suck the very air from it. The two women, who he learned were sisters named Martha and Clara, moved with a quiet, unsettling efficiency. Martha, the one who had spoken first, coaxed the small, silent boy, Samuel, to a stool by the cold hearth. Clara, her gaze still full of a haunted shock whenever it landed on Elias's face, began to unpack a small crate of provisions from their wagon as if she had lived here her whole life. They did not ask for permission. Their presence was a fact, solid and irrefutable. Elias lit the lantern, the hiss and bloom of light throwing their faces into stark relief. He saw the exhaustion etched around their eyes, the hard-worn calluses on their hands. These were not soft women. Life had been their anvil. He saw the boy, Samuel, watching him. The child's stare was unnervingly direct, devoid of fear, full of a deep, ancient knowing that did not belong in a face so young. It was the look of a child who had seen the end of a world. Elias turned away, his jaw tight. He busied himself with the fire, splitting kindling with sharp, angry blows. Every movement was a defense, a wall being built. He could feel the memory, the one he fought every night, scratching at the edges of his consciousness. The smell of smoke, the heat, the screams. He pressed the heel of his hand against his scarred temple, a futile attempt to keep the ghosts at bay. Martha had placed the folded note on his rough-hewn table. It lay there, pale and damning. He refused to look at it, yet he was aware of it in the same way he was aware of his own heartbeat. It was a message from a grave, and he wanted no part of it. A thick silence settled over the room, broken only by the crackle of the new fire and Samuel's soft, even breathing. They were waiting for him to read it. Waiting for him to acknowledge a past he had crossed a continent to bury. The sun rose thin and pale, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plains. Elias was awake before it, the habit of a decade of loneliness ingrained in him. He had slept poorly, his cot feeling like a bed of thorns, the presence of others in his sanctuary a constant, low-grade abrasion against his soul. He expected to find them waiting, expectant, but the cabin was filled with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Clara was at his stove, her large form moving with an economy born of long practice. Martha was sweeping the floorboards with a makeshift broom of sagebrush. They had taken over. It was not an invasion of force, but of quiet, inexorable purpose. They saw a need and filled it, a concept so foreign to Elias's self-imposed exile that it left him adrift. He stood in the doorway, a stranger in his own home. Martha looked up, her expression unreadable. "There is coffee," she said, her tone not offering, but stating a fact. Elias took the tin cup she indicated, the hot metal a small, sharp anchor in his confusion. He watched them, his mind a turmoil of suspicion and a deeper, more painful emotion he refused to name. He had built this life to be a penance, a fortress of solitude. Their quiet domesticity felt like a violation of its grim sanctity. The boy, Samuel, was sitting at the table, meticulously arranging 3 smooth stones he must have found outside. He didn't look at Elias, but Elias felt the boy's awareness of him, a silent orbit of observation. Later, Elias went out to chop wood, the rhythmic shock of the axe a familiar comfort. He worked with a fierce, focused energy, hoping to sweat out the tension, to reassert his dominion over this small patch of earth. After a few minutes, he sensed he was not alone. Samuel stood 20 feet away, a small, still figure against the vast backdrop of the sky. He just watched, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn trousers. He did not speak, did not move closer. He was a sentinel, a small, grave witness to Elias's life. Elias ignored him, splitting log after log with punishing force, but the boy's silent presence was a question he could not answer, a judgment he could not escape. He was the ghost of a different boy, from a different time, a face seared into Elias's memory by fire and failure. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of a merciless sun. The women did not speak of the note. They did not speak of why they had come. They simply existed within the rhythm of his life, slowly, inexorably altering it. Martha, with her quiet strength, mended his worn shirts with thread she had brought, her stitches small and neat. Clara, whose eye still held that flicker of pained recognition, proved to have a gift for cooking, turning his meager supplies of flour, beans, and salted meat into meals that felt less like sustenance and more like communion. Elias maintained his silence, a stony island in the small sea of their domesticity. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. Wood's low water needs hauling. He kept his distance, but the space between them was shrinking. One afternoon, he was sharpening an axe head on the whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. Samuel was nearby, trying to build a small dam in a trickle of runoff from the water barrel. A sharp cry cut the air. Elias looked up to see the boy clutching his hand, his face screwed up in pain. A long, wicked splinter of wood was buried deep in the fleshy part of his palm. Before he could think, Elias was on one knee beside him. "Let me see," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Samuel hesitated, his dark eyes welling with tears, but he held out his hand. Elias's own hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard labor, were surprisingly gentle as he took the boy's small one. With the tip of his knife, he worked with intense concentration, his breath held tight in his chest. The boy barely flinched. When the splinter was out, a single drop of blood welled on the boy's skin. Elias wiped it away with his thumb. For a fleeting second, the boy's small fingers curled around his. It was a brief, light touch, but it sent a jolt through Elias, a warmth that was both terrifying and profound. He looked up and saw Clara standing on the porch, watching them. There was a deep, knowing sadness in her eyes, an expression that seemed to encompass all the years of his exile. "He is brave," she said softly. "Like his father then," she added, her voice dropping lower, full of a terrible weight. Lena would be grateful. The name hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned into the harsh daylight. Elias felt the scar on his face tighten, a phantom pain that was all too real. The larder was thinning. A trip to Prairie Ridge was unavoidable, a 2-day ride to the dusty collection of buildings that passed for a town. His first instinct was to leave them. To ride out and never return, to find a new place, a deeper solitude. But when he looked at Samuel's solemn face, at the quiet, resilient strength of the two women, he found he could not. The thought of them alone, vulnerable in this vast emptiness, was a weight he was not strong enough to shrug off. It was an unfamiliar, unwelcome feeling. They all went, the three of them sitting in the back of the wagon, a strange, silent family on a grim pilgrimage. The town of Prairie Ridge was little more than a main street caked in dust, a saloon, a general store, and the sheriff's office. People stared as their wagon rumbled past. They stared at the two large, somber women and the quiet boy, and then their eyes settled on Elias, and the staring turned to whispers. He was a known quantity here, the mad recluse from the plains, the man with the scarred face and the haunted eyes. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of leather, coffee, and judgment. The proprietor, a wiry man named Jedediah with eyes like chips of flint, watched Elias over the counter. "Thorn," Jedediah said, his voice laced with a dry, knowing condescension. "Running low on solitude, are we?" Elias ignored him, handing over his list. Jedediah's eyes flickered to Martha and Clara, who stood near the door, their presence filling the space. "Starting a congregation out there on the flats," he drawled. Elias's hand clenched into a fist. "Just get the supplies." Jedediah began to measure out flour, his movement slow and deliberate. "Funny," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried through the entire store. "Didn't figure you for the family type. Not after what happened to the Millers. Not after the fire." The name, Miller, struck Elias like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face. The scar on his temple burned. He could feel every eye in the store on him, feel their judgment, their old, buried accusations resurrected. He snatched the filled sacks, threw the coins on the counter, and turned to leave, his movements stiff and jerky. As he passed Clara, he saw that her face was a mask of pale, cold fury. Her eyes were not on Jedediah, but on him. The ride back to the cabin was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence, the unspoken words heavier than any cargo they carried. The moment the wagon creaked to a halt in front of the cabin, the fragile truce of silence shattered. Elias had already begun unhitching the horses when Clara's voice, low and trembling with a decade of suppressed rage, cut through the twilight air. "You never told anyone what happened." It was not a question. It was an accusation. Elias froze, his back to her. "There was nothing to tell," he bit out, the words tasting like ash. "They're dead." That's the story. He heard her heavy footsteps in the dirt behind him. "They think you ran," she said, her voice breaking. "They think you were a coward." Or worse, he finally turned, his face a granite mask of pain. "What do you want from me? Why are you here?" he demanded, his voice raw. "How do you know my name? How did you know to find me?" Martha had come to stand beside her sister, her expression one of deep, abiding sorrow. It was she who answered, her voice steady. "Because Lena was our sister," she said. "Clara and I. We are her blood." The confession landed in the space between them, rearranging the world. Elias stared at them, at the familiar set of Clara's jaw, the shape of Martha's eyes, and saw the ghost of the woman he had tried to save. He saw Lena in them. Her husband, John Miller, he was a good man, but he was in debt, Martha continued, her voice a monotone of remembered grief. "Deep in debt to men you don't borrow from. The night of the fire, it wasn't an accident, Elias. They came for him. You just happened to be there, visiting. The story tumbled out, a torrent of truth that washed over him, eroding the foundations of his guilt. He had been delivering a horse to Miller that night. He had stayed for dinner. He remembered the sound of splintering wood, the shouting. He had tried to get Lena and her boy, her first boy, Thomas, out of the house. He remembered the heat, the searing pain as a burning beam fell, scarring his face. He remembered pushing Lena towards the window before the roof caved in. He had failed. He had run. But he hadn't run from cowardice. He had run from the failure, from the face of the man who had started the fire, a man with connections who had made it clear that the official story would be a tragic accident, and that Elias Thorne, a drifter, would be the most convenient scapegoat if he didn't disappear. "We came because of Lena's last wish," Clara said, her voice softening. "She survived for 2 days after. She told us everything. She told us you tried to save them. She told us you were a hero." Elias stood motionless, the wind whipping his hair, the world tilting on its axis. A hero. The word was so foreign, so contrary to the narrative of guilt he had built his life upon, that it had no meaning. He remembered the fire, the suffocating smoke, the weight of the fallen beam. He remembered the look on Lena's face, not of fear, but of fierce, desperate love as she shoved her son, Thomas, towards him, screaming for him to take the boy and run. He had grabbed the child, but another timber had fallen, separating them. He had seen the roof give way, swallowing Lena and her husband in a roar of flame. He had failed to save any of them. He had carried the weight of 3 deaths. "Her boy," Elias whispered, the words ragged. "Thomas," Clara shook her head, fresh tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Thomas died that night." With his father, a new wave of grief, sharp and piercing, struck Elias. He had not even known the boy's name for certain, a final testament to his failure. He sank onto the wagon tongue, the strength gone from his legs. He finally looked at Samuel, who had been watching the entire exchange with his unnervingly old eyes. "Then who?" Elias started, his gaze fixed on the boy. It was Martha who answered, her voice gentle. "After you fled, our lives fell apart. We lost our farm. We had nothing. Clara's husband passed a year later. Samuel is her son." She finally stepped forward and pressed the folded, worn piece of paper into his hand. It was the note he had refused to touch. "Lena made me write this, just before she passed. She made me swear I would find you one day, if we ever needed help. She said you were the only man she ever knew who was strong enough to stand against the wind." Her words were the key. He had thought the request, relayed by the man who brought them as far as the plains, was to marry them, a desperate, transactional plea. But that wasn't it. That was a crude summary from a man in a hurry. Lena's wish was for protection. For sanctuary. For him to be the rock she believed him to be. He looked down at the paper, his hands trembling. The words were faded, written in a spidery, weak hand. "Elias. It was not your fault. You were brave. Forgive yourself. Keep them safe for me. Lena." It was absolution. A pardon delivered a decade too late, but it landed with the force of a physical blow, shattering the prison of guilt he had so carefully constructed around his heart. A sound tore from Elias's throat, a strangled sob that was a decade in the making. The stony mask of the recluse crumbled, and for the first time since the fire, he wept. He wept for Lena and John Miller, for the boy named Thomas he had failed to save. He wept for the 10 years he had spent in a self-made hell, flagellating himself for a crime he had not committed. He wept for the man he might have been. The 2 sisters did not move. They simply stood, their presence a silent, solid bulwark, allowing him the dignity of his grief. Clara came and sat beside him on the wagon tongue, placing a large, warm hand on his shoulder. It was not a gesture of pity, but of shared sorrow, of understanding. Samuel, who had watched everything, walked over and, with a solemnity that belied his age, placed his small hand on Elias's knee. It was a simple, profound act of acceptance. Elias finally raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed, his face streaked with tears and dust. He looked at these three strangers who were not strangers at all. They were a legacy. They were the last living pieces of a life he thought had been utterly destroyed. They were the embodiment of Lena's final, desperate act of faith in him. He had come to this desolate place to be alone, to punish himself. But Lena had sent him the one thing that could truly save him, a reason to live for someone other than his own ghosts. He looked at Martha, her face weary but full of a deep, resilient peace. He looked at Clara, whose eyes no longer held judgment, only a shared, painful history. And he looked at Samuel, a boy who needed a protector, a guide. The request to marry them had been a clumsy translation of a dying woman's desperate hope that he would provide a home, a shield. That he would become the head of their broken, scattered family. In that moment, surrounded by the vast, indifferent landscape, he made a silent vow. Not to Lena's ghost, but to the living, breathing people before him. He would be what she had believed him to be. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh edges of the plains began to soften with the coming of a wetter, warmer spell. Tiny purple wildflowers bloomed in the shelter of the rocks. The change was not just in the land. It was in the small cabin that had once been a tomb of solitude. The silence was different now, no longer empty but filled with a quiet, companionable peace. The smell of baking bread often mingled with the scent of sage and dust. Elias found a new rhythm to his days. He was still a man of few words, but his silences were no longer hostile. He spent his afternoons teaching Samuel how to read the tracks of coyotes and rabbits, how to hold a knife to carve a piece of wood. He saw the boy's quiet watchfulness slowly transform into a quiet curiosity, and then, one day, into a bright, sudden smile that felt like the sun breaking through a decade of cloud. Martha and Clara had established a small, hopeful garden behind the cabin, coaxing stubborn life from the hard soil. They worked with the same steady, relentless purpose they applied to everything, their presence a constant, grounding force. They rarely spoke of the past now. There was no need. It was a shared landscape they all inhabited, a common ground from which this new, strange life was growing. One evening, as the sun bled orange and gold across the horizon, Elias sat on the porch, watching Samuel try to skip a flat stone across the water barrel. The boy's laughter was a sound he was slowly getting used to. Clara brought him a cup of coffee, sitting in the chair beside him. They watched the sky together for a long moment. Elias unconsciously raised his hand and touched the scar on his face. The skin was smooth and familiar, but the phantom burn of guilt was gone. It was just a mark now, a map of a place he had been. It no longer defined him. "It's a good evening," Clara said softly. Elias looked at her, then at the small, sturdy cabin that was no longer a prison but a home, and at the boy who was learning to laugh again. He nodded, a small, true smile touching his own lips for the first time in memory. "Yes," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It is."